Good afternoon. My name is Mike Denniston, and I've been retired from Georgia Perimeter College for about 2.5 years, something like that. In 2012, a year before well, a few months anyway, before I retired, my wife wanted to take a cruise somewhere, thinking about doing some traveling. So we were looking at Viking River cruises and looking at various options. And one of the ones that came up was to Portugal, which sounded pretty nice to me. But by the time we hummed and hawed, why the vacancies were all filled up. So I'm thinking, as I look over the choices, say, well, you know, if we're going to do this, why not do something that's really grandiose, something that's a bit adventuresome, because you're likely to be in that part of the world maybe only once or twice unless you happen to make your living there. So I said, hey, let's go ahead and go to China. And after my wife picked herself up off the floor, considering how adventuresome I am about such things, well, she said, yeah, that'd be great, because she has always wanted to make sure she visited all of the continents, and at this point in time she has, which is kind of neat. And China has been sort of a peripheral interest of mine for a long time. If you teach environmental science, you come upon China very, very often. I see one of my ex-students here. She knows all about the fact that maybe one of the first assignments that we had in environmental science was to read a discussion of what happens in China environmentally. And it's kind of an eye-opener because it shows you what can go wrong. And I'll have some things to say about that as time goes along. What I want to do here is to pretty much do the same type of thing philosophically that I tried to do when I was teaching, and that is to plant a bunch of seeds. Not really to say anything very extensive about any one topic. So if there's anything frustrating about this, it will be that I will spend a little bit of time on this and a little bit of time on that, and I'll move to something else. I think that's a plus and a minus when it comes to things like this. An outline. We'll talk about some very basic preliminaries. Travel is very much like scientific investigation if you do it right, because you start with a limited body of knowledge, you want to know more, and then you ask yourself, what sort of activity should I invest myself in order to increase the knowledge that I have and make myself more comfortable with the environment that I see. So we'll be talking about some basic preliminaries. We'll look at some geography. One of the things that always impressed me or sometimes depressed me about the GPC environment is few people know very much about geography. There have been times when we've had case studies, say, on parks in the area, up in the Smokies, for example, and I asked people, well, if you wanted to drive to that area, well, how would you do it? What highway would you take? Well, to get to the Smokies, they wanted to take Interstate 20 going west. Well, you can get there that way, but it'll take you a very, very, very long time. So consequently, geography is important. Then we'll start talking about some of the particulars about the trip, some things about Shanghai, about the river part of the cruise itself, the Three Gorges area, which is absolutely magnificent, then some of the areas that are perhaps not so familiar to Western tourists, Chongqing and Xi'an, and then ending up in Beijing. Let's start from preliminaries. By preliminaries, I mean the types of things that you need to think about before you hop on that airplane. One of those preliminaries, of course, is a passport. You've got to have a passport. Go through the State Department, fill out your forms, do it mostly online. Costs you about $100, and the passport's good for about 10 years. That's good. However, With China, there's the additional problem in that you got to have a visa. You cannot get into the People's Republic of China without a visa. And visas are a little bit tricky because the people that I've talked to anyway, you don't do them on your own. You do it through an agent. Or at least if you do them on your own, you've got to have some sort of people that know how to do what needs to be done. So the river cruise that we were on from Viking sent us about 6 months in advance this rather extensive questionnaire for a visa. And it is extensive. It asks you if you've ever been thrown out of China, for example. Like, have you ever been convicted of a crime, so on and so forth. It also asks your employer. It asks about various things that are quasi-personal. So you fill this thing out, and you include, more than 2 years ago, $388. I suspect it's no cheaper, probably more expensive if anything. And then you send it in. Well, I send it in, and then about 4 weeks later, I get an email from the agent saying, please scan your Georgia driver's license and send that in as well. Okay, scanned it, send it in. Lo and behold, I get an email from a FedEx or FedEx package is ready for it. Because if you're doing this and your trip depends on your having the visa, you buy all sorts of fringe stuff like insurance and special handling and things like that. So it tends to add on to the, but anyway, we got done what we needed to get done, and voila, there's the visa, which is attached to the passport. If it wasn't bad enough just to wait for a visa, of course they have the passport, your passport as well. So the visa is fastened directly to the passport. So if something goes wrong with your visa application, your passport's in Never Never Land as well, which gives you kind of the palsies because Viking wants a certain amount of money for this, everybody wants a certain amount of money for this, and all of a sudden you find out, well, you're at the mercy of, you could be at the mercy of the post office, God forbid. So you usually put yourself in the mercy of FedEx or somebody like that. Some other important stuff, of course, like the owl and the pussycat, you can go to sea with a beautiful pea green boat. You take some honey and plenty of money. What kind of money are you going to take? Well, you can take dollars, but ultimately you're probably going to have to convert at least some of them into renminbi, abbreviated by either the yen sign with CN in front of it, or sometimes abbreviated as RMB. And the currency itself is called yuan. And yuan is about 1/6 of a dollar. It's worth about 16 cents. It's extraordinarily undervalued for years and years and years. The Chinese have been bumming up against the economic authorities saying, well, you need to inflate your currency a bit. The reason they do that is very obvious. They're the world's greatest exporter, so that makes their goods very, very cheap. And Walmart loves it. A lot of consumers love it, so on and so forth. Language, it's a very different language. It's a pictorial language. It can be translated into things that you can sort of figure out how to say them, but some of this translation is more effective than others. If you want to say hello, ni hao for hello, goodbye, yajam, I don't want it. And this is maybe the most important thing that you will learn, because the Chinese for thousands of years have been merchants. They want to sell you something. That may be in a very grandiose way at a Mercedes dealership or Rolls-Royce dealership, or most likely it's going to be at a much smaller scale in, say, along the street or in a market or something like that, and you're deluged by a lot of stuff that You might find at the dollar store, that you might find at Walmart, other places like that. Booyah. Booyah. I don't want it. Another important thing, of course, for all travelers, what about the men's room? What about the women's room? Men's room, non-women's room, new. This is just a part of the problem, however, especially when it comes to things like toilet paper. Many Chinese restrooms have toilet paper now. It's more so since the Olympics, but in many cases they don't. And the reason is rather simple. In a developing country, if you, and particularly in out-of-the-way places, if you leave lots of toilet paper around, why the population will steal it. And another problem, more often a problem for women than for men, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this. I think your imagination will be good enough for you. But the Western-style potties for women very often are missing. And you have what is commonly called squatty potties, which is essentially bullet-shaped, a hollow, encumbrances, and you straddle it. Flush like any other, but the women in our group, my wife especially, were very happy when there were airports that had Western-style facilities within them. Now, some preliminaries include, of course, geography. What are we doing here? How are we getting to where we're going? Well, we are right next door, of course, to a really fine airport, Atlanta Hartsfield International. So you show your passport, you show your visa, you put your money on the line, you hop on a Delta flight, and we started by traveling. It'll take you pretty close to 14 hours to get to Tokyo. And then from Tokyo, a short hop, a couple of hours into Shanghai. The trip that I took spent a couple of days in Shanghai. Then we hopped on an airplane to move into a place called Wuhan. Wuhan is where we met up with the Yangtze River, hopped on a boat, and then traveled about 700 miles, show more detail in a few minutes, on the Yangtze through the Three Gorges Dam to the end point at Chongqing. Then from Chongqing, got on another airplane, flew north and slightly east to Xi'an. It's an ancient city, ancient walled city, where we'll see some very interesting, outstanding examples of ancient art. And then finally to the capital of China in Beijing, and from Beijing on home. Let's start by looking at Shanghai. Shanghai is an ancient, well, not an ancient, it's an ancient city in some ways, but it has only fairly recently been important on the world stage. Up until about the end of the 19th century, Shanghai was a little bitty village. But then the advent of the Brits, of course from UK, led to the Treaty of Nanking. It had to do with opium and all sorts of undesirable stuff. And the Treaty of Nanking actually allowed free trade from, among other places, Shanghai, also Hong Kong. The city of Shanghai became an outpost of glamour and high living, ultimately decadence. Matter of fact, things like opium were rampant in Shanghai for a long period of time, especially to in the first few years of the 20th century. And ultimately, the Chinese threw the Brits out, and in 1949 the communists took over. Shanghai is at least the most western of the cities that we saw. In 1990, the Pudong area, which is what I'm looking at right here, the east bank of the Long River, of the Huang River, became essentially an economic free zone. So what that meant, it was a lot of places built, headquarters there in order to do business with the roughly 1.2 billion Chinese people. This is the Pearl TV tower. This is probably familiar to most people if they've ever seen an Apple commercial. You see that skyline at night, and it really sticks out with this tower. It's Shanghai is an interesting place. Lots of fun areas to go to. This is taken from an area across from Pudong, a very large promenade called the Bund. Behind the Bund are lots of hotels from and other facilities from the British era. You see hotels that were there in the 1900s, all very beautiful, all very nice. Shanghai's a fun place to be. Being tourists, we find ourselves from time to time being transported to places that are interested mostly in selling you stuff. And in general, that is the stick part of the whole deal, unless you happen to be interested in their merchandise. The carrot part of going to some of these commercial places is they invariably provide lunch. And the lunch, of course, is free, and they treat you very nicely. This particular place in downtown Shanghai, the Shanghai General Carpet Factory. This sounds very generic, and it is very generic, but it is a state-owned business. Included in the carpet factory is a Mongolian barbecue. Anybody ever been to a Mongolian barbecue? Mongolian barbecue is unique. I don't know if it's going to catch on in the United States or not. I would tend to doubt it for a number of reasons. In a Mongolian barbecue, what you do is to queue up before a huge table of ingredients, and you have a plate, and you have things like vegetables and meats and all sorts of things like that. You put it on a large plate. Then when you get to the end of the line, you have this large circular oven that spins. So you take the contents of your plate and you dump it on this large circular plate, this oven, and then it circles inside the little booth where the gentlemen are cooking it. And then, being circular, it comes out the other end, and there it is, and somebody scoops it up and puts it back on your plate after it's been cooked. Then you go get your other stuff. There's obviously rice, and there's obviously cookies, particularly those almond cookies that are very good. And then you eat. My wife was never convinced that she was getting the same thing that she put on, and probably that's true of a lot of folks, but it's very, very showy, very interesting. The carpet factory is interesting, and I might say expensive as well. The ladies that do these carpets are amazing, particularly the ones that are, say, floor length. They are busy doing these things, and it takes something like 6 years, I think, for a person to actually be ready to manipulate the loom that makes some of these large rugs. In addition, they have people that do things that are more artistic. This is one example of the Great Wall. This is all done in silk thread. It's gorgeous. This particular one is, price of it is $1,880. There were some of these that were, say, maybe close to being as large as this blackboard that ran around $20,000. And there were people in our group who actually bought several for their house, for their homes. The shipping is free if you passed a certain point. I think if you spent $10,000 or $15,000, they ship it for nothing. But yes, they are gorgeous. Yes, they are expensive. But yes, that's why we you get a chance to go get a free lunch. Now, at this point, we are ready to move on, to move into the interior of China and the Yangtze, which is called the Chang. So we hopped on a flight out of Shanghai into Wuhan. Wuhan is really the first place that is convenient for a ship on the Yangtze River, at least heading from east to west. The Yangtze is about 4,000 miles long, but only about 1,700 miles of it is actually navigatable. So yeah, if you really want to, and you can start in Shanghai and you can go down the Huangpu and ultimately find your way to the Yangtze, but you'd have to do it in what is essentially a sampan or something that's relatively small, and it's not particularly scenic, is my understanding. This is a picture of Wuhan. This is the only time when we were able to see the moon. The sky's relatively blue here. Wuhan is actually a name that is a sort of a contraction of three individual cities that came together: Wuchang, Hongkou, and Haoyang. And these cities actually date all the way from about 770 BC, so they've been around a long time. When you get on the ship, and this is, as you can see, a bit out of focus for a couple of reasons. One, the photographer probably was moving the camera. Another thing is that we were bobbing up and down, so on and so forth. But if you look at the water here, it sort of resembles chocolate milk. And we'll have quite a bit to say about water in China in a few minutes. When we left port, why, the current was relatively swift, and we were moving out of the industrial area, and what you would see invariably would be these little cargo ships, relatively small, that would have sand or that would have coal. But the current was, I would say, pretty significant, pretty impressive. That would change relatively soon. Farther on down, you started to see, again, old industrial plants like you see here. This is probably a sand and gravel plant. It probably burns coal, so you're seeing lots of particulate matter being evolved into the atmosphere. and the river itself, sort of chocolate brown color, you can't see more than a few millimeters below the surface. The Chang, the Yangtze, has been a working river, of course, for several thousand years. Farther on down, you start to see more building. This probably is a coal-fired plant with the smokestack and a little bit of a surprise to me, cooling tower. Everybody know what a cooling tower does? Keeps the surrounding river at the same temperature as it was when the water was taken out of it. When you have a coal-fired plant, when you have a nuclear plant, you have to have cooling water, whether you use coal, whether you use nuclear, and that water, when it comes from its job of cooling, it's going to be very hot. If you dump it in when it's hot, it doesn't have any oxygen in it. Doesn't have any oxygen in it. It prevents life from existing in it. If you do that to too great an extent, what you find is that the area near the shore is devoid completely of life. So cooling towers are really a good idea, an obvious idea for people that are environmentally cognizant of that problem. Clearly, the Chinese, at least at this point, have gotten the idea, because you can see that the tower, the cooling tower, they're still being constructed. The Chinese burn a lot of coal. It's only been in the last year or so that the amount of coal that they've been burning has started to taper off. Every year, more coal, more coal, more coal. Their air is polluted. Their water is polluted. Their land is polluted. And one of their responses to this, of course, is to try to access renewable forms of energy. One of those renewable forms of energy would be hydroelectric power. About half of the large dams in the world are in China. This is a direct difference to what is present in the United States. In the United States, we tend to want to blow up dams. More dams have been blown up by a long way over the last 10 years than have been constructed. This dam is the first one that we saw on the Yangtze. This is at the, it's called the Jijiao Dam. It was constructed in 1986 at the city of Yichang. The ship is right, our ship is right behind this one that's going into the lock. We are at the high side, so what you find is in this lock is that when you enter the lock, the water will be pumped out, your ship will drop, and then you'll move out to the behind the dam where the water level is slightly lower. So this shows what it looks like going into that single lock dam, and this shows what it looks like as the gate is shutting behind you. So consequently, these dams are used for several purposes. One, to try to control the current of the river, and two, to generate hydroelectric power. Once we pass that dam, what you find is that your river more or less becomes a lake, because the current is no longer as fast as it was before. And that's particularly the case in the Yangtze Valley. The impact of these dams is rather considerable. And we'll be talking about that in the next few slides. The Three Gorges area is beautiful. It reminds one in some ways of the Grand Canyon, except of course for the very major difference is that the climate is different. These areas are covered with green, with trees and various vegetation, and the Colorado River Canyon, the Grand Canyon, is not. It also turns out that the Grand Canyon is significantly older than the canyon around the Yangtze. So you see all of the, this is in great contrast to what you saw around the first dam. And then you wake up the next morning and you see all of these hills and valleys in front of you. This is a sign in Chinese that essentially says, "Welcome to the Three Gorges Dam area." This probably is close, if not exactly, near a town called Wushan. Wushan had to be moved about a mile inland. The original town of Wushan is underwater. So the Chinese moved it back away from the river, and they did this with a number of others that were smaller as well. Now, what we did was to go down the river until we reached the entrance to the Three Gorges Dam. The Three Gorges Dam is something like 180 meters high. So you come in on the high side, you enter a lock, and then in 5 separate locks, 5 separate stages, you'll eventually end up at the other side of the dam. If you look at this bridge is kind of a landmark here. This picture was taken when we turned the corner after heading past that bridge, moving into the first of the 5 stages of the locks. It takes about 4 hours to go from the high side all the way down to the low side. The next morning, after we had gotten through the lock and had gone to bed, gotten up, eaten our breakfast, I went out on the balcony and took this picture. Beautiful area, but it's also a little bit sobering as to how much of this beauty comes from the fact that there's so many particulates in the air. So you see all this red and blue and others, and yes, it's beautiful. But the sky itself is rarely totally blue. It's usually white because of all of the suspended matter that's present in the air. To give an idea as to roughly where we are, as soon as we got done with breakfast that day, why we went on a tour of the dam itself. So we went to an observation platform, and I took a picture from what's called the Jar Hill area at the base. This is an escalator that takes you up to the very, very top. So this is only about, well, this is at the top of the dam, but not quite the top of the facility. If you look closely, you can see the bridge that we passed a minute ago right here, slide, So this is the high side right here, and this is a ship that is coming into the lock like so. Again, about 180 meters, that would be, what, 560 some odd feet. And looking off in the other direction, this is the low side. That is over on, looking in this direction is the slide that we just saw, and in this direction we have the dam and water going over it here generating electric power. The Chinese expect that ultimately the Three Gorges Dam will generate 10% of the power that is needed by the People's Republic in China. At this point in time, they have a long way to go before that comes about. In addition to touring the dam, we wanted to look at the area around it, that is the Three Gorges area. This bridge is at the beginning of one of the tributaries of the Chang called the Denniston River. Denniston River is interesting in that it's scenic, but it also has a lot of artifacts from previous cultures that lived in the area long time ago, maybe 1,000, 2,000 years ago. And needless to say, it's gorgeous. We got into a smaller boat and we worked our way down the Denniston River till we reached this particular area, which is both interesting and kind of heartbreaking. The area that you see here is part of a cultural thing that was done by either the Ba or the Pu people, whoever actually carved these out of the limestone cliffs. These are what's called suspended coffins. And originally these were probably 300 or 400 feet above the ground. But with the Three Gorges Dam coming in, the water level, of course, has risen rather significantly. So if you look very carefully, and again, you really can't tell without going in there. You probably wouldn't want to go in for a number of reasons. But if you look in here, well, you see sort of cylindrical type things that may or may not be coffins. One of the most interesting these are suspended coffins. Some of the most spectacular of them are found as you go farther into the river. Say you have areas that are very high up, and there may be crevices in the wall that look like so. What the people have done is to suspend these coffins on essentially cables. And again, these may be 300 or 400 feet above the river. So they buried their dead. I mean, really the most obvious place that they could bury them. You can't dig a hole somewhere. You can't just put it on a riverbank. So they elevated these. Along the river as well, a pagoda. This is the Shabozai Pagoda from 1650. If you look at these, there are 12 stages, 12 floors. 9 of those were constructed about 1650, And for some reason or other, the last three were constructed in 1956. I'm not sure why they decided it was necessary to gild the lily, but they did. So this is a really impressive facility from the outside. If you go inside, there's absolutely nothing in there. But it's a Buddhist shrine, and below it there is actually a monastery. Culturally, the town of Shebos is down at the bottom of the Yangtze River. It was covered up because of when the dam came in 2008, 2009. One other landmark I think that's important to think about. This is the city of Fuling. Fuling is, according to the geographical dictionary I have, a city of 1 million or less, just before you reach the end of our river tour in Chongqing. The interesting thing about cities along the river is that you don't see very much going on. You see all of these buildings, and you see virtually nothing going in, nothing going out. You see these types of things, very small cargo ships. In many cases, and again I can't say for Fuling, but in many cases what you would find if you were to dock here and move up on the dike, this is the dike that protects the river, protects the city from the river. What you would find is that many of these buildings are completely vacant. And the reason is that there is a movement in China from the countryside to the city. The city is where the action is. The countryside is where the action was. And they're expecting more and more movement of people from the country to the city. These provide a lot of jobs. Unfortunately, however, once they're constructed, they just sit. And there may be a caretaker, there may be nobody. So economic activity is such that you have a useless asset, at least for the time being. The Chinese keep believing, keep thinking, and keep moving their population from the countryside to the city, so ultimately one day these may all be used. But as things stand right now, there are several places in China that are designated as ghost cities, and sort of bothering. In Chongqing, Chongqing is a city of about 31 million. Chinese told us it's the biggest city in China. Other folks say that Shanghai is. So pick whatever you like. But Chongqing is, we didn't stay there very long, about half a day. Chongqing is of interest historically in that during World War II, General Stilwell commanded the Flying Tigers, who held off the Japanese along the Chinese border with Burma in 1941 and 42. There is a museum dedicated to this in Chongqing. We went past it, or at least in the vicinity. We didn't stop there, but where we did stop is at the zoo. We spent maybe an hour, hour and a half at the Chongqing Zoo. And of course, no trip to China is complete without viewing the panda. And there's the panda. Interestingly enough, the Chinese, of all the things they could say about the panda, were most proud of the fact that he had lots of offspring in various places in the Chinese world. So we hopped on an airplane and then back to Xi'an. This is China Eastern. There is also a China Southern. The China Airlines, the two that we saw, very impressive, I would say. At least service on a par with the United States. Not that that is anything to get real excited about, but they were polite, and they at least tried to feed you well. You would always get a meal. The meal, in most cases, would be essentially a piece of what we might call Spam, pork, and some rice, maybe some tea or some sort of drink, and a cookie. It wasn't bad. I like pork quite a bit. It was decent. The interesting thing about China Airlines is that there's no first class. When the plane is ready to leave, it's sort of like reading a benediction in church. Everybody gets up, and away you go. You file into the aircraft. Now, well, there's assigned seats, but you can't tell first class from any other part of the plane. But the flight crew was very diligent. One of our members of our group actually thought that he was having a heart attack. So they delayed the flight and now asked for a doctor. So it turns out the gentleman had gastric distress, which wasn't too unusual in our group because there's significant water problems in China. They took him off the plane, took him to a local hospital, and away they went. But they followed the procedure, the protocol, I think, as well as anybody. This is Xi'an. Xi'an is in north central China. This is either the Yellow River or a tributary of the Yellow River. The Yellow River is one of the three major rivers in China, including, of course, the Yangtze and the Mekong. The yellow is meanders all over the place. It is yellow because it picks up vast amounts of soil. Its course is very unpredictable. In the late 1600s, the Yellow River turned south for no very good reason and killed 300,000 people in the floods. For years, people have, in the north part of China and the people in the south part of China have tried to join the waterways. Chinese are trying to do that now. As to whether that will ever come about or not, I don't know. But just before you get to the Three Gorges Dam, why there's a pipeline that's being constructed, and that is supposed to be ending up in the northern part of China near the Yellow River. The walls of Xi'an are ancient. Xi'an has been a capital city in the state of Ba since about 1000 BC. It's a very ancient city. Walls cover many of the large cities in China, including Beijing. I'll talk to you about that in just a couple of minutes. I'm running a little bit short of time here. The most interesting part of Xi'an is the terracotta warriors. The first emperor of China ruled over that area about 2,200 years ago. When he died, he had, over the past who knows how many years, had his craftsmen build something like 8,000 clay figures of infantrymen, soldiers, archers, and these were found in 1974 when a bunch of farmers were digging a well. So this is just one of the digs, I think dig number 1 if I recall correctly. There are something like, I think 6,000 of these figures. They're all life-size. And originally, these figures were colorful. All were colored. Each had individual hairdos. Each had individual expressions. You may have seen these in the High Museum 2008. Excellent demonstration. On to Beijing. I'm running out of time here. Beijing is the political center of China, and as such, it's a little bit different than some of the others because you see policemen, you see government, the impact of the government around all over the place. This is a view out the hotel room. You can see in here the top of the Olympic Stadium. This is the gate to Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is the governmental plaza where many of the government buildings are located. To get to this, the bus essentially drops you off in front of a metro station, and then you take a tunnel underneath the street, and you end up right smack dab in the middle of the square. One of the most interesting parts of Tiananmen Square is this. This is the Mao Mausoleum. These folks are waiting to see Mao's corpse. Ever since he died, he has been held in state. So every day from, I think it is in the mornings and in the afternoons, in the morning they bring him up out of the refrigerator. People view him. At the end of the day, they put him back in the refrigerator and we start the whole thing over again. This has been the case ever since this mausoleum has been constructed. This is the Tiananmen itself. The Tiananmen is the place where in 1949 Mao announced the formation of the People's Republic of China. And in front of this Tiananmen there's about as much traffic as you can imagine. Lots and lots of people on cars and motorcycles, bicycles, things like that. Right behind Tiananmen Square is the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City is the area that was used by the emperors of China, the Ming and the Qing emperors. This was finished construction in 1420, and for the next 500 years they ruled within this very large area. it was off limits to common people until ultimately the last emperor abdicated in 1912, I think it was, and then it was open to the public in 1949. This is the Meridian Gate. If you look around the other side of this, what you'll find is a very narrow entrance. And once you go into the entrance, you go into a very, very, very large courtyard. You start by going over this particular area, which is called the Bridge over the Golden Waters. This is made out of marble, and it covers a very large moat. You look at the moat like so here. There are 5 marble bridges that cross it, signifying the 5 traits of Confucianism that were important at the time of the emperors. Once you get past that, you will go into the Gate of Supreme Harmony. The group that you see here, this is our tour guide, a fellow named Joshua. We're standing here on the gate of, let's see here. Now, this is the Gate of Supreme Harmony is where we're standing here. This is the Hall of Supreme Harmony that's up here at the top. And Joshua is, as I said, was our tour guide. Joshua told us before we got into this area, before we got into Beijing at all, he said, please don't ask me any questions about politics because I could get into rather significant trouble. One thing that you see rather quickly in Beijing when you're in part of a tour guide, especially in areas like this, is that the tour leader may be talking to you for a few minutes and saying this and saying that. All of a sudden you find that your group, which was maybe 20 people, is now 50 people. And the extra people are all locals. So do they spy? I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me too much. On to the Great Wall. This is the battling area of the Great Wall, which is northwest of Beijing. This is one of the portions of the Great Wall that is in the very best shape. The Great Wall at this point is about 8 meters high and about 7 meters wide. As you notice, in some places it is extremely steep. I can imagine climbing this wall in a windy day and having it be just about impossible. You notice there are rails along the side. If you look all the way down here at the bottom, well, at the top from where I'm standing, the top, that's where you get into the wall, and then you can walk for as long as the wall happens to be. Sometimes some of these walls are badly decomposed. Some are in excellent condition. Of course, if you're close to the city, well, you got a pretty good chance of seeing walls that are in good shape. We're ready to go home. But before you go home, I think there is one picture that I took that maybe sums up a lot of the problems in China. This is a Chinese drinking fountain. And the water in China is polluted. You don't drink water out of the tap. You don't even brush your teeth with tap water. You don't even rinse with tap water. So in the airport, I took a picture of this drinking room. What you find is that one side has hot water, one side has cold water. So you provide your own vessel. You open the hot water side to get hot water. You open the cold water side to get cold water. Okay, we're off. I'm just about out of time here. Probably already am out of time. So we flew from Detroit, from Beijing to Detroit, and then from Detroit home. My seatmate on the other side was a young lady from Beijing. Her mother is a business executive in Beijing. Her father teaches at a college in Toledo, Ohio. And she, like many children of prosperous Chinese, is interested in going to school in the United States. Of course, that's where she's going to high school, where she plans on going to college. So you very often find that among Chinese, that the Chinese are really interested in opportunities in the United States or opportunities outside China. Our tour guide, I asked him what I ask students, where do you want to be in 5 years? And he said, surprising to me, I'd still like to be a tour guide, but I'd like to be doing it in Australia. With that, I will say appreciate your attention, and are there questions? Some Chinese do. If you look at areas, particularly downtown Beijing, where you will see lots of folks with cloth masks. How much good that does, it's hard to say, but the air is very thick. And there will be days where it's just as white as, well, it's sort of an off-white. A blue sky day is very unusual. And it's not going to get any better until they get away from coal or do something with the coal to keep the particulate level down. They're trying, but it's going to be tough. I didn't, but there's no reason to think that it doesn't happen. The major problem with pollution is in the middle of the country around the Yellow River. The Yellow River is about half of the water in the Yellow River is unfit, not just for drinking, but even unfit for industrial use. It is, they've got a real mess when it comes to water. They've got 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of the water, and much of that's polluted. So they've got major economic problems just based on water. And not even mentioning other things that we've talked about. Bottled water. So the hotels provided you with, I think, 3 bottles of water a day, something like that. And you'd get more just by asking. But it's interesting, on the boat, we had fish all the time. Some rather tasty carp, which I tried once, but you ask yourself, well, if the water's no good, why are we eating the fish? And about half of the people in our tour group had some sort of problem with gastric stress. So some of it, I'm sure, is just schedule and other things, but nonetheless, it doesn't take very much to make you sick if there's bacteria in it. Anything else? I'm sorry, there's one more. Oh, yes. There's no doubt about it. The Chinese are trying to anticipate the movement from the countryside to the city, and they think ultimately that these ghost cities will be filled up with people that have undergone that migration. The real problem, of course, is that you just don't want people to fill up these buildings that aren't doing anything. What you want is economic activity. So you'd like to have people come into the ghost cities and then do something, provide goods, provide services that will enhance the country and will provide additional jobs and services. The Chinese government is scared to death of the prospect of there being vast amounts of unemployment, which leads to vast amounts of unrest. The Chinese, historically, whenever regime change has come about, it's been extraordinarily bloody. You don't want that. I don't want that. Nobody wants it. It would be economically upsetting to virtually every country in the world, and it would be very, very unfortunate. No, as a matter of fact, I was surprised as to how freely we got along with everybody. They certainly welcomed our money, but the people were very friendly by and large. They as I said before, they're merchants. They like to sell you stuff, but if you just say no, hey, go on to the next person. They don't really too much care. There were a few instances where there were people that were harassing. If you take the tone that you really don't want it, they'll back off. But the diversity in economic situation is really, well, it's very troubling. I mean, you pull into Shanghai, for example, and right next to our hotel, there was a Rolls dealership and a Mercedes, and I think one or two others that I don't remember. You go down the block, and man, this is in summer, you'd see people milling around outside. Well, the reason they're milling around outside is that their housing has no air conditioning. And China this time of year, well over 100, exacerbated by pollution, and many apartments don't have any sanitary facilities, so they line up each morning to use the public facilities. It's especially the case in Beijing. So there are very much in the way of haves, millionaires, billionaires, and there are have-nots who don't have anything. So it's a very interesting, but also in many regards a troubling situation.